Muy buenas tardes con todos. Good afternoon. I am Maria Rosa Vaquerizo. I'm the CEO of the Andean American Associations, and I would like to welcome you to today's program. This program is hosted and has been organized by the Ecuadorian American Association. It's Ecuador's latest developments. We have a fantastic panel with us today. We have Lucila Barbeito of JP Morgan. We have Walter Spurrier of the Spurrier Group, Alejo Shirwonko of UBS. We are grateful to all, our panel and to all of you for your participation. Just a few words about the Ecuadorian American Association. It was incorporated in the US in 1932, becoming the very first Chamber of Commerce of Ecuador in the US. Our association has hosted hundreds of programs, and we're celebrating this year our 91st anniversary. For today's program, we have over 130 registrants, and we welcome this very distinguished list of participants this afternoon, including our supporters, EAA Director Arthur Barnes of Deltec Asset Management, our former president of the Ecuadorian American Association, Rene Valverde. We have 5 representatives of Banco Pichincha, Miami Agency, a leadership circle member of our association. We have with us also today Nelson Baldeón of Global Consulting Solutions. There are many governments also in line, and we have, of course, Ecuador and the US, among other governments. We have representatives from major financial institutions, such as Asobanca, Bantrust, Chase, Citi, Goldman Sachs, Santander, Scotia, State Trust, Sumitomo, Mitsubishi UBS, and Wells Fargo. We have also with us the multinational and the key institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and UN Development Program. With us is also the World Bank. And we have 2 rating agencies. We have Fitch and SP Global. From the academia, we have the American University, Columbia, MIT, and UCLA. And from media, we have Ecuador News One and El Diario New York. Welcome to each and every one of you, and thank you so much for your interest in our program. Please note that our speakers' remarks are their own views and are not expressions or positions of the Ecuadorian American Association, since we are apolitical. It's very important to notice that at the bottom you have a Q&A button, and you can press that at any time during the conference, and you can write your questions, and they will be answered at the end. Now, it's a pleasure to present to you the president of the Ecuadorian American Association, Economista Juana Caicedo Selinger. She's a senior vice president at UBS Financial Services in New York. Juana, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Maria Rosa. Welcome everyone to this program today. Thank you to Lucila, Walter, and Alejo, and to all of you for being here today. I believe it is the most opportune time to discuss the current political economic situation in Ecuador and the challenges the country is facing. Our speakers today will help us to understand the current situation and what the future may bring. I would like to introduce briefly our moderator, who will introduce our speakers. You may refer to the invitation for further information about them. Alejo Shirwonko is Managing Director and Chief Investment Officer, Emerging Markets America for UBS Global Wealth Management based in New York City. In this capacity, Alejo leads a team of analysts focusing on emerging markets, macroeconomics, and the development of investment ideas in these markets. Alejo frequently appears in Bloomberg TV, CNBC, and CNN, and regularly contributes to financial publications, including the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal. Alejo earned a PhD in economics from Columbia University. And now, Alejo will introduce our speaker and begin the discussion. Alejo, you can start the program. Thanks.
Juana, thank you so much for the introduction. Everybody at the Andean American Association, always such a pleasure to work with you. I think this is an extremely timely panel, and I'm excited about the speakers who are going to be joining me in the discussion, starting with Lucila Barbeito. Welcome, Lucila, dialing in from Buenos Aires. For those of you who don't know Lucila, she's an economist in the research department of JP Morgan. She covers officially Argentina, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, and of course also Ecuador. Before JP Morgan, she had a stint at Fitch Ratings, based out of Buenos Aires as well. And she holds a master's degrees in economics from Universidad de Itela and a bachelor's degree in economics from Universidad de Buenos Aires. Terrific to be with you. We also have Walter Spurrier with us. Walter is a seasoned economic analyst. He's the president of a consultancy that carries his name. He's dedicated to the study of economic and political developments out of Ecuador. He's an advisor to the Chamber of Industry of Ecuador and a professor at Casa Grande University. He holds a master's in political sciences from UCLA. Walter, thank you so much for joining as well. Why don't we dive right in? And what I'd like to do first is to level set and ask a fairly basic question, kicking off with Lucila. What happened in Ecuador on February 5th? And why do you think this matters?
Thank you very much, Alejo. And first, let me thank everyone in the Ecuadorian Association for the invitation. Great pleasure to be here. So yes, as you said, February 5th proved a game changer, in my view, in terms of the political risks ahead that we are facing. Let me first start with some brief factual about what happened in terms of the referendum and the regional elections outcome, and then also very brief commentary about how we interpret these results and what to watch going forward. So basically what we saw first was a widespread rejection in the referendum questions that the government launched. This was a surprise if you looked at the polls, because all of them showed approval ratings above 70% for each questions, but it was not quite surprising if you observed the past correlation between the government approval and the referendum outcomes in the past. And that is something, a risk that we flagged in most of our notes, because we saw that the president government's approval was very low, and that in this context, it was a very risky bet to launch a referendum, because that could be framed as a plebiscite on Lazo's administration. And that is actually what I think it ended happening. The regional elections outcome also was surprising in the sense that the Correísmo did better than expected. We were not expecting, let's say, a very strong performance of the government because of the low approval rate, as I mentioned before. But yes, I think here the surprising, let's say, the main surprising event was that the Correísmo, for example, was able to take the Partido Social Cristiano, the historical stronghold that was Guayaquil. And they also did very well. Well, they won the majority also in the city of Quito. And altogether, I understand that still the final results are pending to be, let's say, released, but they obtained, according to the preliminary official results, the largest number of majorities in the recent election, with around 48, followed by Pachacutic with around 24. So the Sunday's vote, I think it revealed the relative strength of the main opposition parties. Also, I think that it prompted the government to recalculate once again the strategy ahead. The result, I think, emboldens the opposition, and also it raises questions around, the governability prospects of the current Lazo's administration. After this, what we saw was the announcement of the government of a new cabinet reshuffle. Basically, the most important, let's say, change there was the Ministry of Government. Jimenez was out, and Henry Cucalón, who was a former member of the PSCC, was appointed as the new Minister of Government. I believe, in my view, that the changes are perceived as positive. I don't know if this is still enough, but I think the attempt there was to bring some oxygen to the Lazo's administration. And from now onwards, the key would be to improve the political coordination of the government and also the execution capacity. I think that are necessary conditions for Lazo's administration to be able to muddle through.
Thank you, Lucila. That was a terrific answer. I'll move on to Walter now. And the question here has to do with, a lot of debate about whether President Lazo can finish his term, about the likelihood of fiscal consolidation taking place, of economic reforms being pushed through. Can you walk us through the political scenarios in your view for the remainder of 2023?
Well, yes, Alejo. Thank you for this invitation. As you know, the first time with the association here in New York. I'm actually in New York right now, and I hope to be again in the future. It's the elections results spooked the markets, and spooked the markets because the best scenario for the markets was a Lazo re-election, since the debt, Ecuadorian debt with the financial markets was restructured under Lenin Moreno, and Ecuador doesn't have to pay a principal on that debt until 2026, and that's the next government. So the idea was the best case scenario was a Lazo re-election, and Lazo was working on the re-election and was fairly confident he would be re-elected. These results put in doubt that he would be able to get re-elected. So from that standpoint, that scenario loses some ground. The second aspect that worries the market is the good showing that Correa's side had in this election, since Correa, remember, Correa defaulted on the debt when he did not need to do so. He did that on political grounds. So the chances that if Correa, and not Correa, but one of his minions gets elected president, it's on the table, the possibility of a default. However, I don't see that scenario as highly probable, no, because my reading of the good showing Correa had in this election is because he was able to get back into his group the people that left with Lenin Moreno. Lenin Moreno, the previous president, came from his party, and of course, people who wanted to continue being in the government went with Moreno. Now they have gone back to Correa, but he has not gone above his normal level of the votes. He's still the number one political force. However, it's a larger number of people who are against him. He took Guayaquil because the Social Christians started to punish people when Cynthia took over as mayor, and it impoverished much of the party. So there was a low voting for the PSC party, and actually you have other candidates that came from the PSC party. So I think the second scenario we have to say is that somebody else could be president, somebody who's not on the front line could be the next president of Ecuador beginning 2025. He could be, who knows, somebody in the center left, or he could be a Bukele type figure. We could speculate on that. The third problem is whether Lazo will be able to finish his term. And there is in the assembly all kinds of moves to remove Lazo from government. I don't think any of those moves have any chance of success. I think Lazo's danger of not being able to finish his term is the uprising from Leonidas Issa. Leonidas Issa has a very good image abroad. People think that the Andean countries owe to the indigenous people for the conquista, but Leonidas Issa is a ruthless person. He in front of his troops, he puts women and children, expecting somebody gets killed, and so he could claim that there is police brutality. He had two successful uprisings. If he has a successful uprising, which means that the armed forces decide not to defend Lasso, then probably he will be defenestrated by the ISA uprising, and the assembly would then pass a resolution impeaching the president, essentially to give some varnish of legitimacy to a coup d'état. The other scenario is that Lasso is able to finesse the situation of indigenous, and that he lasts his term. However, he cannot count with support from the assembly to bring changes in economic legislation to allow the country to have a better rate of growth, and therefore be able to meet the new debt commitments that come due beginning in 2026. However, there's much he could do administratively, because his administration has been, I would say, very poor management in both the political and economic front, except in handling the debt issue. But in matters of attracting foreign investment, in matters of dynamizing the mining sector and the oil sector, they have not done a very good job. Perhaps they're going to improve that now. Now, the big problem, however, in all of these scenarios, the biggest danger for Ecuador to be able to meet its commitments in 2026 is the country risk itself. In other words, with country risk so high now, there's no way Ecuador would be able to get issue new bonds in the market, and you cannot expect Ecuador to pay up the debt without issuing new debt. I mean, they have fixed their financial situation quite well, but not enough to be able to reduce foreign indebtedness. So if country risk remains at the levels it is now, if Lasso is not able to bring it down, things are going to be tough, even if the new administration is willing to pay.
Thank you, Walter. There's a lot to unpack there. I'll bring you back in a minute. I wanted to ask Lucila first. The bread and butter of what you do, Lucila, is forecasting macroeconomic variables. How do you see the outlook for growth, inflation, and other key macro variables pre and post February 5th? And specifically, looking at the external sector, can China and the reopening of its economy come to the rescue of Ecuador's growth, inflation, etc.?
Thanks, Alejo. So that's, I would say, a very tough question, because after February 5th, I mean, we're still reassessing our base case scenario. And in this regard, the political situation is so fluid that we are waiting for the next key weeks to reassess the risks around our main base case scenario. That said, I agree with what Walter has just said. We still believe that the base case scenario for us is still one where the current administration manages to muddle through to the remainder of the mandate, mainly because we don't see incentives on the opposition side, at least not at this point, to force an early election scenario. But at the same time, we continue to believe, and these recent political events reinforce our call for the very limited degrees of freedom that the current administration has to push forward structural reforms, and the limited upside we can see in terms of further fiscal consolidation ahead. So against this backdrop, what we see, and going into our macro forecast, is for this year, we see a real GDP growth deceleration to 2.5% year over year. That is deceleration from around 3% that closed last year. The risks here, I would say, are skewed to the downside, basically on the risk that Walter mentioned. The main risk here is social protests, and we will see the meeting with between the indigenous movements tomorrow to see whether there are upcoming measures against the government. And given the experience of June protests here, what we would need to watch very closely is whether these protests, gain scale, because this could imply a big hit for the macro. That call for a growth deceleration is also based not only on subdued investment prospect, but also lower inward remittances based on the expected global activity slowdown that we are forecasting, that our house is forecasting, let's say, at a global level. Then on the fiscal front, as I said before, an improvement here in budget execution is key. and also the potential deployment of further social measures in order to contain the protests. So in a way, as we call it, let the macro flow into the micro, that I think that was one of the, let's say, key weaknesses that we saw last year in the last administration. On this regard, the 2023 budget already entails a strong increase in permanent spending for about 0.8 percentage points of GDP. We assume lower projected asset sales than those in the 2023 budget. So we have a higher overall central government deficit, and the budget we have 2.6% of GDP this year, which implies, let's say, a slippage from the 1.7% that it closed in 2022. Then going more to the external front, we continue to expect a current account surplus next year, because although we see softer oil prices, this will remain supportive for Ecuador's trade balance. Yet what we see is a narrowing in the current account surplus. And this is basically predicated not only on softer oil prices, but also on subdued export volumes and on the contraction in remittances that I mentioned before. So all in all, what we are projecting is a 1.3% of GDP current account surplus this year from the 1.8 we project that closed 2022. In all, what we believe is, the macro picture still remains supportive when you compare to other LATAM peers in the region. The reserves, the growing, effects reserves offer a cushion. Government deposits, also savings from last year's oil windfall, is also positive. Yet here, obviously, the relevant risks are on the political front that continue to drag the credit in the short term. From a medium-term perspective, what I would like to underline is that more work needs to be done to secure fiscal and debt sustainability, because, as Walter mentioned, the financing picture becomes more pressing from 2026 onwards as external debt maturities increase. So I will leave it there so as not to extend that much in time, but we can continue discussing later.
Very good. Let's bring Walter back on. I wanted to double click on your comments, Walter, on country risk, which, as you said, extremely elevated. 1,600 basis points over U.S. Treasuries. Absolutely, accessing markets is a no-go at these levels, as you highlighted. The country has almost $20 billion in external bonds outstanding. The question to you is willingness and ability to pay. How has this been impacted by February 5th? I believe you highlighted that the probability of a default remains contained. If you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, see, a lot depends who's going to be president. As you see, we do not have, Ecuador doesn't have to pay interest, doesn't have to pay principal, and therefore it's a moot point whether you want to default or not. I'm sure Lazo's never been for default. He's a banker. He resigned when he was a minister of Jamil Mawad. When the Mawad administration decided they were going to default, he resigned. And so there's a whole history that debts have to be paid. So under the scenario that he is reelected, I would think he would find a way not to default. The point is, who would be the next president? And I would say that most of the political leaders in Ecuador do not have a firm commitment towards restructuring the economy and being in good terms with the international financial community. So, as I said, a lot hinges on who will be the next president, and a lot hinges on whether the creditors will be willing to find a solution. See, now Ecuador's country risk is so high, essentially because of its past history of defaults. And as I like to say, it is one World Cup which Ecuador disputes with Argentina, who defaults the most. And so that's the reason that us too countries have such a high country risk. But as I say, much depends on who is the next government. And right now, that picture is very murky.
Understood. Talking about creditors, Lucila, one large creditor of Ecuador remains the IMF. For background, the country recently negotiated a $6.5 billion program. What role does the IMF play in this saga in coming months?
So the IMF program that expired in December, the country has, for the first time in several years, successfully completed an IMF program. I think that program served as an important anchor for Ecuador's fiscal consolidation. And now the main question mark is whether Ecuador will engage in a new program with the IMF. I think at this point, and given the political noise and the political backdrop, it's very premature to say that the authorities will go for a negotiation of a new program. But if the political situation settles down, let's say in the second half of this year, we can see that the authorities could start evaluating different alternatives. In my view, an EFF program is out of the cards because the program is a long-term program that requires strong conditionality in terms of structural reforms. And as we discussed in prior questions, this administration has little margin of maneuver in terms of pushing forward in Congress further structural reforms. So the way I'm thinking this is that the authorities have, I think, formally expressed intention to tap, the resiliency and sustainability trust. And for tapping, that financing, you need to have an eligible program with the IMF, so an active program with the IMF. That's why I do believe that Ecuador will go forward, but with a non-financing program. For example, looking at different experiences in Central America and also South America, for example, Paraguay, there is a type of program that is called Policy Coordination Instrument. PCI is the acronym. It's a non-financing, more short-term program that enables, to continue with a fiscal consolidation effort, to continue under a framework of market-friendly policy that could serve as an anchor for the markets and could also help Ecuador, allow Ecuador to tap RST financing. How much RST financing can Ecuador tap? According to the rules of this resiliency and sustainability trust, that could be up to 150% of the quota. That is, in Ecuador, around $1.3 billion. This is not all upfront, but this could help to narrow or to close the financing gap through this or next year. So I think that's something that could come by the second half of the year and that the authorities could start evaluating once the political situation settles down.
Very good. I will soon open it up to questions. So as Maria Rosa and Juana highlighted, if you want to reach out to us, type your question in the Q&A portion of Zoom and we'll prioritize them as they come in. I wanted to ask Walter here, on a forward-looking basis, what are some of the signposts that you have in mind to gauge the overall direction of the political and economic situations? What should investors and policymakers be looking out for?
Well, as Lucia mentioned in the first reply, there have been some changes in the cabinet. And I would very much wish that the last administration gains in effectiveness. In the political front, he has now what was probably one of the most important leaders of the Social Christian Party, and which will be able to manage much better relationship with the assembly, to be able to throw water to any fire that could be in the assembly trying to get rid of the president. Then also he has a new appointment in energy, in energy and mines is in the areas where there is a possibility of attracting substantial investment. And we have had an instability in energy and mines. And I hope that we get new oil contracts to increase our oil production. And that will be also a good measure to see that the country would attract investment and move some more of the economy and that and get the economy rolling and improving the economic perspectives for the 2 or 3 years time, because we would have an enhanced oil production. And I would like also to see a better message from the president to be able to improve his image, which I think he has done a poor job in bolstering his image. So I would look to see how the new oil contracts go along, or the oil contracts which are in the pipeline, whether permits are open in mining, whether the government stands firm with indigenous. I'm certain that the indigenous are going to make another uprising, like the one they did against Moreno and the ones they did against Lasso. But I would like to see that the government has a better tactic to control it. If the government is able to diffuse that uprising, that would be a very good sign that Lasso would finish his term. And based on the work from his new ministers, we could have more efficiency. There's much that can be done with current legislation. We are not going to have perhaps labor reform, but you can have attract more investment in different areas of the economy if you get the bureaucracy working. Essentially, you get over all the roadblocks that the bureaucracy placed for the different investment programs to get through.
Thank you, Walter. We have a couple great questions that came in. The first one, I'm going to direct it to Lucila and see, maybe Walter, you have comments after that. Lucila, what is the outlook for potential debt for nature swap in Ecuador? Can that get done? Will the country be able to reduce its debt using this type of transaction? Have you looked into it?
Yes, so I mean, the latest formally that we heard was back then when the president announced that this transaction was something they were working and they were planning to announce in the coming weeks, but actually the announcement never actually transpired. Basically, concretely, what circulated in the press was that this would be a 1 billion blue issuance bond that will be financed by guaranteed by multilaterals, and that the government will use the proceeds of that 1 billion bond issuance to repurchase debt for around $3 billion. We haven't heard any formal, let's say, announcement since then. My understanding is that this is a very, complex transaction, that there's also locally some hurdles in terms of the liability management legislation. So, I mean, I think the government continues to work on this front, but still, I believe that maybe not in the very short term we would hear an announcement. Hopefully, we do hear it, but at least on my side, I don't have any further information. So I think this could be a really positive market catalyzer, at least, for the short term, together with an IMF program announcement. So we should need to watch whether there are few more news on that front.
Very good. Walter, anything to add there?
Yes, I agree with Lucila that say the last word on that as it's not possible until we see the documents. But my understanding, and that's not going to help the Ecuadorian financial situation, because when Ecuador buys these bonds, essentially what it means is that Ecuador is going to pay the interest on those bonds, money which is going to be spent on environmental programs in the Galapagos. Essentially, it has to be in the area where between Ecuador and the Cocos Islands in Costa Rica. It's a new area which is going to be protected that joins the two archipelagos. And therefore, you would have money for this program, essentially ships perhaps to monitor the area, but on the other hand, Ecuador will be paying for it. So it is not as we will be retiring debt, and then Ecuador have to have a lower impact in its debt service.
Excellent, Walter. Let's stay with you. Another interesting question, follow on the IMF, right? Arturo is arguing that Ecuador will find it hard to pay the IMF starting next year. So wouldn't it be wise to seek an Argentina-like soft conditionality loan to refinance what they have coming due in 2024, 2027? So over to you, Walter. You can address this and the IMF involvement more broadly too.
Well, I think that the government should look into the different possibilities it has to soften its foreign debt service. So far, the most evident source was the $1.3 billion that Lucia mentioned. The minister Rosemena is on the record saying that Ecuador is not going after those funds, but the information I have through the back channel is that that's his declaration, because that's not in the budget, but that they are going to go for it on the second half of the year. That's information I have through the back channel of the Ministry of Economy. I think, I don't know, I really don't know how far is the IMF willing to go, or what other measures the IMF and other multilaterals have, what other tools they have to reduce Ecuador's substantial debt service. But in other words, the relation Ecuador has with the multilaterals it's excellent. But I haven't heard about any other initiative.
Terrific. Lucila, anything to add?
Yes, no, on that front, I think I mentioned this briefly in the prior question, but basically pushing or refinancing the maturities for 2024, 2027 will require an EFF program. And I don't believe that right now there's the political willingness, or not maybe willingness, but ability to commit into an EFF program, right? Because of these, binding political restrictions. And that's why I believe that this RST, PCI, alternative is a way out, and could also offer some, financing in the short term and provide some release to the financing, to the government's financing program. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. We have one more question. Juan is asking about the contagion that everything we've discussed on the economic and political front is having and can further have on the corporate sector and corporate bonds. To the extent you can comment, Lucila, any views there?
I really don't think that, it will depend on how the political outcome, ends up developing, in terms of whether this actually forces, an early exit of the president, or whether the ability of this administration remains to muddle through and to, as Walter said, improve, execution capacity. But on that front, and I think Walter can speak better about this because he's involved in the, in the daily local context. But basically, over the several years, what we have seen is that, in a way, the corporate sector have been able, to post a good performance, despite that sometimes the macro has not accompanied. And I believe that this would be the case, going forward, barring aside a very, turbulent political scenario that could put into question, the willingness of the sovereign and the corporates to service debt. But I believe that the corporate sector is very strong, and that therefore I don't really envision any, potential contagion, at least not at this point, to the corporate sector. But I let Walter complement, because maybe he has more view on the local corporates.
Well, in the local picture, if we're talking about the situation in which Ecuador is going to have a harder, tougher time to meet this budgetary deficit, then the government is going to be tempted to placing bonds with the local banks. And that's going to reduce financing to the corporate sector, and it's going to push interest rates up. So that's a danger the business sector is looking at. Then in Ecuador, you can divide the business sector in two broad categories. One is the export-oriented. The shrimp sector has grown substantially, and now Ecuador, it's a main non-oil export, and Ecuador is a leading exporter of shrimp. However, this expansion in production has brought a substantial drop in the price of shrimp. So here, one thing that Alejo mentioned when we started is whether China would be able to help. Well, if a Chinese market recovers, the shrimp price could go up. At least that the corporate sector would have a better time. Another area in which a local sector has been growing is continue increasing the retail sector. You have more and more shopping malls being built, and that area of the corporate sector is also going up. You don't have much dynamism in, say, the manufacturing sector. Some of the manufacturing sector is linked towards export products. Some of the manufacturing sectors depends on protection from import substitution. And Ecuador is still one of the countries that has the most protection for its local industry, but it is going away. Much of the business which is oriented towards export is putting some hope in the trade agreements that Ecuador is negotiating. The ones with China and one with South Korea is coming. The one with Mexico got stalled, but one in Canada is coming up, and they see there the opportunity for some economic growth. But on a context of an economy seen to be growing, say 2.5 a year, as Lucila mentioned, much investment for the domestic market is not really encouraged. And I would see that the areas where we could have a more important private investment would be in mining. And there, essentially, you would have to get a better, a faster processing of environmental licenses by the Ministry of the Environment, which is the main choke point for the development of mining sector. The other being, of course, the attacks from the indigenous on mining areas.
Thank you, Walter. We'll stick with you to the extent you can address this question. An attendee is asking about Petroecuador and its willingness to honor, by and large, terms of contracts, especially regarding capital projects such as refinery upgrades. Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, the government did not manage well the oil sector from the start, from May of 2021, when it started. It waited for Petroecuador to choose a new CEO using business standards. The authorities of Petroecuador, starting with the Minister of Energy, did nothing. Then the president appointed somebody else to Petroecuador, and he got involved in some scandal. And right now, Petroecuador doesn't have a CEO at this moment. So it actually hasn't had. You have had no continuity in almost 2 years of the last administration, and that means that these programs are stalled. Then comes the Minister Santos. Minister Santos is trying to push things up, is trying to urge Petroecuador to appoint a CEO soon, and he plans to push for these programs. This is something which I addressed earlier, saying that one of the signposts would be to see Santos getting through, pushing through with help from a new Petroecuador administration, the new refinery or refinery overhaul, if you want to put it that way, the contract for the Amistad field in the coast, bringing out more blocks out for auction in the Oriente. And remember that now that the Colombian government is officially said it wants to get out of oil business, you have a large number of middle-sized and small companies that work in Colombia, that if they're going to lose their business and have no chance to grow in Colombia, the obvious option is to move to Ecuador. It has the same geology. So the investors are there. I mean, not everywhere in the world you have people willing to invest in oil, but Ecuador, the investors are there. So one of the signs that I'm looking for is for Santos to push in the oil sector and have results in the oil and miner sector soon. And that would be a plus for the Lasso administration.
Terrific. I think we'll wrap up with a question for Lucila, simply because Walter already addressed a range of different political scenarios in coming months. Lucila, if you can help us, there's a question that wants to double click on your view of political scenarios, central, upside, downside, if you can share.
Yeah, sure. So this goes very much in line with what Walter said before, but basically here I think that another important event to watch is, you know, that the Correísmo is trying to push an impeachment in Congress for President Lasso. There are different, constitutional mechanisms. Basically, you have two articles of the Constitution, 129 and 130. They tried back in June to do an impeachment based on social commotion and political crisis, and they failed to achieve the 2/3 of votes to succeed in that attempt. According to the Constitution, you can only use once that constitutional tool. So according to my understanding, there is no further possibility to go through that channel. So what they are trying to do now is to try to build, based on the corruption allegations in the state of, in the management of state companies, a case for impeaching Lasso under Article 129. That is actually what we call in Spanish enjuiciamiento político, or political trial. There's a commission at the National Assembly that is preparing a findings report. They just asked for additional 10 days. They were going to issue, the findings report, actually, I think today, and now they asked for more time. The new deadline is early March. So we watch for this, and actually, again, the process here is a process that takes around 50 days, according to the Constitution, and they still need 2/3 of the votes. I believe that here, the Correísmo has around 48 lawmakers. You need 92 votes, so still they need the vote of minority, let's say, parties, the Partido Social Cristiano, Izquierda Democrática, and so far I don't see the incentives aligned for these parties to provide, the voting on this case. It's important to note here that if this is approved, it wouldn't trigger an early election scenario, but the resignation of the president and the takeover of the vice president. But still, I agree with Walter that I don't believe this attempt will, pan out in Congress, but it's worth watching how this develops during the coming weeks.
All right. With that, we'll wrap up the content portion of the event. Thank you so much, Lucila, Walter. I personally learned quite a bit. We went fairly deep into the topics. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks again. And over to you, Maria Rosa and Juana.
Okay, thank you, Alejo. Thank you very much. An excellent panel, and I think clarify and answer many questions that we have about the election and the problem later on and the political situation of Ecuador. Walter, I understand you are living in Ecuador and you can be more involved in what's going on daily basis. And I have one question for you, if I can make it. I see we have a few minutes. What is the Constitution saying about so many blank votes in Ecuador? There are candidates that has 30%, 18%, and even like a 50% blank vote. What is the Constitution about that? Or there is anything about that?
Well, let's remember that we have a fairly new constitution, and many things we do not have. We really don't have a precedence of how things have been interpreted. Something which is very unusual in Ecuador today, and I would think would be unusual anywhere, is that for all of these discussions we're having about whether we have too many blank votes, or whether the president could be impeached on the grounds he's been impeached, although you're going to have like cross-death. Constantly you have constitutional experts appearing on news programs and discussing this, because we really don't know what the rules of the games are. The people in general are quite upset, because the reason they voted blank is because they don't believe in this institution. And now the only people who believed in this institution of Citizens Participation Council is Correísmo, because this is an institution similar to the Soviets. You know, it's the same idea that you have a Soviet, which is a ground level organization, and the real power of the people is in the hands of the Soviets, but actually it's a dictator, the one who says what the Soviets are supposed to do. And that's what Correa created it. And now, since people who are not from Correístas and don't believe in the institution did not vote, now it happens that this Consejo de Participación, Citizen Participation Council, has a Correa majority. So I guess it's going to be there, and that is it's going to be an important tool for Correa to be able to appoint a controller that is going to clean his slate, or another of the state officials which are not under direct government control is going to be able to control it through the Citizens Participation Council, which has no legitimacy from the point of view that, as you said, people decided that they don't want to vote for people they didn't know, for institution that they didn't like.
Thank you, Walter. Okay, so going back, and thank you very much for your answers and our questions, and also to clarify us about what is going on in Ecuador. Hopefully later on, maybe we have a follow-up program later on to see what is happening. Alejo, thank you very much. And Maria Rosa, I give you some final remarks.
Okay, thank you. Many thanks to Lucila, Walter, and Alejo for providing such an enlightening discussion. We are a non-for-profit organization, and our support comes from membership and sponsorship. Please join the Ecuadorian American Association via replying to today's invitation. Thank you very much to all for your participation, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you. Good afternoon. We have a little bit of time, but that's, we finished the program earlier. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Ciao. Gracias, panelistas.